Yeah, there was basically no way I was going to wait until Friday to talk about this news, especially given it's about my pride and joy, the PS3, one of my favorite consoles ever. Really, it is my favorite. But we have a semi-fresh new rumor here about PS3 emulation on PlayStation 5 and Sony finally working on this. And I say it that way because this actually is a older rumor dialing back to about 2 years ago from Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb, where at the time he mentioned he had heard Sony was working on this. And that was really the only time where we ever had some kind of credible rumor about Sony working on PS3 emulation, because at least with Jeff, he's well connected, he knows people, he networks. We often hear a number of things about what's coming up in the video game landscape from Jeff Grubb, so that's really the only instance where it was ever some sort of credible rumor. Every other time we hear about PS3 emulation, and longtime viewers of the channel know this, because I often have to show up and debunk these things, but we never actually get anything that is real evidence of it happening or coming or showing up or Sony working on it, right? It's either some kind of patent that people just completely misconstrue, or Sony is teasing something and people, again, completely misconstrue that, or we have a little oddity on the PSN backend where PS3 games, which were there, before anyway, but they're pulling metadata from PS Now rental prices, and that was a whole big fiasco, right? But every other time this comes up, right, we never have anything that's truly credible about Sony working on PlayStation 3 emulation. But we had that one instance from Jeff Grubb 2 years ago, and so recently, we had a few days ago on the Xbox Era show, Nick Baker, he had mentioned that he had heard about this, which I believe that's probably what spurred the one article that then got Jeff to talk about this again during a recent episode of Game Mess Morning. So that was yesterday, and now the headlines are getting shared around on Reddit and places like that, right? So it's obviously a big deal because this is right off the back of some recent new releases on PlayStation Plus Premium for, Daxter on PSP. We finally have PS2 games back, and so there's a lot of renewed conversation around classic games, which, believe me, I'm all for. But Jeff mentioned recently on Game S Mornings that it's still something that he's heard has been in the works for quite a while. He actually was speculating that he thought it would be announced earlier this year, and just saying that, that clearly didn't happen, but that doesn't mean it will never happen, and that's really all it is, right? So it's not quite a new rumor, but I guess it's renewing the conversation surrounding it, because he's still, him and Nick are the primary ones saying that, yes, we've heard about this and that it's coming. So there's really not much else to go on outside of, I guess, a few things that I always like to add on this topic of PlayStation 3 emulation. And the one going thing we've always had, right? Because there's so many sort of things working against the possibility of PlayStation 3 emulation on PlayStation 5. Not so much, obviously there's all the other factors we can normally name off, right? Cell is difficult to emulate. They have to monetize it. Financially, it never really makes sense or pencils out for Sony. Backwards compatibility, as much as we all love it as enthusiasts, it's not used all that often, right? So it's really more of a goodwill program at the end of the day. There are a lot of things working against PS3 emulation, but the one thing that has always, made a lot of sense is that eventually they have to do something. What I mean is they have PlayStation 3 server blades that were established and made over 10 years ago with PlayStation Now, and those are the same, highly custom server blades with like 8 SoCs on one board, and those have been primarily operating this entire time, and that's the way that we play PlayStation 3 games on PS4 or PS5 hardware. And they're not going to keep maintaining those server blades forever. They're certainly not manufacturing or bringing new ones online. They're not manufacturing cell anymore. It's the same ones that are still operating. They're also probably terribly energy inefficient, and they're just not good, right? The experience is pretty poor. So the one thing we've always been able to look at here is just simply like, okay, well, at a certain point, they're going to decommission those servers, and what's going to be their answer then? I think anybody can reasonably expect that the long-term, more sustainable play is emulating PlayStation 3, especially because if they do, say in theory, get this working on PlayStation 5 hardware, then you could at a certain point offload that to PlayStation 5 server blades because they would be title ID'd as native PS5 games. Really, this is the big upside for also PlayStation 4 playback as well, which we've talked about before. I think long-term, that's what they're looking to do, obviously, is just decommission the PS3 and the PS4 server blades. Those ones aren't really all that great either, and delegate all this to just a big farm of all these separate data centers with these new PlayStation 5 server blades that are so far, at least for the PS5 titles that we can stream, the performance there is really good. But that's obviously just for streaming, right? The caveat would simply be, would they want to do this right now on PS5 hardware, or would it also be something where they instead plan on doing this long term for PlayStation 6, where there's more CPU overhead on that console, which would be also a fairly safe guess, because this is still the PlayStation 3 we're talking about, right? The cell processor will always be the massive crux of the issue. It's a very, asymmetric, multi-threaded power PC-based architecture that is a massive pain to emulate, and this is the part of the conversation where everyone loves to chime in and say, oh, what about our PS3? It's a great example in both ways, like both for and against the possibility of Sony finally doing this. That's at least how I've always seen it. It's always incredible what hobbyists are able to accomplish, but that is also a great example of how it took a very long time. A lot of titles just are still very problematic. You need a very capable machine to get it done. Certain titles are playable 80, 90% of the way, but Sony is a platform holder and they want to ship games in a very playable state, right? So there's a very long certification and QA process that titles are going to have to go through, right? So it's going to be a very different kind of thing. There's so many verticals that have to be looked at when you're looking to monetize it. And that's the other problem, is that once we start monetizing emulation and monetizing backwards compatibility, certain things get in the way. So that's the other angle we can examine here real quick, is that let's say this happens. Let's say we finally get PlayStation 3 emulation on even PlayStation 5. So maybe we could see this announced, or it's coming within the next 1 or 2 years, assuming this was something that they were working on for a very long time, because if they were not doing this, like, let's say 4 or 5 years ago already, then like it wouldn't be happening. That's always the case I was making. Like, Microsoft started developing the 360 emulation layer for Xbox One. That was like early back as like, what was it, well, it would have been like 2008 or 9 or somewhere around there is when that program started. Then they had to shut it down. Then they kicked it back up for Xbox One. But I digress. The point is, let's say they finally had this ready within a few years or so. What is that going to look like? Now, I know the immediate thought is, can I use a Blu-ray disc? Well, we can already see the program right now on PlayStation 4 and 5. Even the 2016 program on PS4, that was actually at a time where we had Shuhei Yoshida make a public comment saying, like, well, we need to sell these games again because it needs to make sense for us, for the work that we put into bringing these games back. But even looking at the existing program and also the fresh new PS2 games we're getting, you can't use a disc. It's in theory, Sony could absolutely do it. This is how Microsoft does allow disc playback. It's more of a goodwill gesture on their part. I'll always commend Microsoft for honoring disc playback, which the caveat with that is that it's really acting as a license, because you're still pulling the digital re-released game, because those games all still go through a relicensing process. They go through certification, QA all over again. It's a very slow, curated list of games, and that's what I would also expect this time around. So no disc playback, but also it would very likely be a slow rollout like the PS1, PSP, and PS2 games. I would almost consider more so for PlayStation 3, because the other aspect is that, you can obviously build an emulator, and I mean, one could argue with Sony having source code and official documentation for PlayStation 3 that they would be able to build a solid emulator, and I have no doubt that that's a possibility. I don't even know if they would be doing this strictly in-house, or like, let's say Implicit Conversions is also heavily involved in this. I don't know what would be going on there, but let's say they build an emulator. It's still going to be something where, like, most titles they throw at this emulation layer, like every single game is probably going to give them hiccups, because every single game utilized cell processor in a different way, where they were offloading certain aspects of the game on cell with all the different SPUs. So it's like, and especially first party games, because first party typically were the ones that were really leaning into the hardware the most versus third parties. So even though first parties are the kind of titles that have the most upside, it'd be great to see things like Infamous or Killzone or Puppeteer, all the obscure PlayStation 3 games. There's a lot of titles that are trapped on PlayStation 3, Sony published IP that in theory there's no license hurdle to get over. That means those games can come back on PS4, PS5. Believe me, there's a lot of titles we could see, but those are also the games that tend to be the most problematic as well. So there are a lot of hurdles. This is why for the longest time I've always said, like, just don't expect PlayStation 3 emulation. It's not coming, or at least not anytime soon. But we've done a lot of waiting. So I'm hopeful, because I think that really is the one upside, where it's like they're going to decommission those PS3 server blades. I think the company very much does want to bring this library forward. It's just, that console, ever since 2006, ever since the program at in Austin, Texas, with IBM, Toshiba, Sony, and Ken Kutaragi's vision. I mean, making Cell, it's been biting them in the ass this entire time, all the way up until 2024, and we still don't have these games playable on PlayStation 5. But I think with enough time, it will eventually happen. So those are my thoughts on PlayStation 3 emulation on console, mind you, properly being released through Sony. I do hope it's on the horizon sooner rather than later. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.